North America, where the winds cut like sharp blades and the land stretched as far as the eye could see, the last great struggle for the survival of Vinland was unfolding. The Vikings, known for their ferocity and ruthlessness, were in full retreat. The colony, a land that once seemed promising and full of possibilities, was now being reduced to ashes under the attacks of the Skrælings, the natives, whose screams echoed through the forests as they advanced without mercy. Rurik, a leader with fierce eyes and a fearless soul, knew that his only option was to flee. But death did not seem to be the only threat lurking in Vinland, and as he and his crew ran, fate had something more profound and challenging in store than anyone could have imagined. Amidst the chaos of destruction, when darkness began to take shape and hope seemed scarce, Rurik and his men came across an Algonquian tribe, hidden deep in the forest. Their lands, far from the destruction that was ravaging the rest of the colony, were in perfect harmony with nature. But unlike the Vikings, who knew only war and expansion, the natives were silent, watchful, and suspicious in their veins. Hostile at first glance, the tribe offered refuge, but only on one unforgiving condition: to help defeat an even more fearsome threat, an invasion by other natives who sought to destroy their sacred lands. The fight was only just beginning, and in the midst of the conflict, Rurik found himself questioning something he had never imagined. Was the Viking way of life truly sustainable in Vinland, or was there something deeper, something truer in the natives' connection to the land that he had ignored? Now it was time to join forces, not only to defeat a common enemy, but also to explore the true meaning of survival and wisdom in a land that had never accepted domination. Long ago, when the old legends still burned in the hearts of men, and the horizon seemed an endless mystery, the Vikings set out from their frozen lands, heading for new horizons. Born in the harshness of the northern storms and forged in battle, these men and women knew no bounds. Vinland, a mysterious and distant land that lay beyond what was considered the known world, was about to receive a visit from the sons of Odin. Many said it was a promised land, rich in resources, where they could prosper. But what the Vikings would actually find there, no man could have foreseen. This story begins, like so many great epics, with the impetus of a quest, and the fate of all tied to uncommon courage. Vinland was not discovered by chance. The legendary Leif Erikson, son of the famous Eric the Red, was one of the first Vikings to set foot on the lands of an unknown America. His name echoed through the generations, a symbol of exploration and conquest. But the Vikings' journey to this new world was not an easy one. Leif, in his search for lands beyond the icy shores of Greenland, sailed west, and upon arriving in Vinland, he found its vast, fertile forests and rivers ready to feed and sustain a people as bold as the Vikings. But as with everything in the Viking world, the tranquility was not to last long. The winds of war were ever present, and the native people, the Skrælings as the Vikings called them, soon entered the scene. Even so, the promise of a new life made courage stronger than fear. The colony that settled in Vinland did not last long, but it was long enough for the myth of a land beyond the ice to spread like wildfire. In an age of constant search for new lands and conquests, many Vikings left Greenland, trying to establish a new home in Vinland, in an attempt to escape the hardships of their homelands. However, isolation and the constant struggle for survival in a hostile environment made success more difficult than it seemed at first glance. And it was in this scenario that Rurik, the protagonist of our story, emerged. Rurik was no ordinary man. Born in a small village in Greenland, he grew up amidst snowstorms and the sound of long winter nights. His father, a respected Viking warrior, was an imposing figure in his youth. But it was Rurik's mother who gave him the first lessons that would shape his destiny. She was the daughter of a chieftain of a forgotten Norse tribe, whose rituals and stories spoke of deep connections with the land and spirits. In a society where iron and steel defined a man's worth, Rurik was always fascinated by the strength of the human spirit. More than just a warrior, he saw himself as someone destined to understand life beyond the sword and shield. Over time, Rurik began to stand out among the other young Vikings. He was not only strong, but also cunning, and his skills with a blade were unmatched. His specialty was fast-paced combat, using double-bladed axes and a unique precision that he had honed since childhood. But unlike many other Vikings, he possessed a skill that few could comprehend, the ability to connect with the elements of nature and to understand the changes in the wind, sea, and land in an almost mystical way. His hunting skills were legendary, and his knowledge of the forests and rivers of Greenland was unparalleled. Rurik knew how to survive not only through his strength, but through his ability to sense and read the world around him. It was during a time of great tension between the Viking colonies in Greenland and the native Skrælings that Rurik was called to join a small group of Vikings who were attempting to explore Vinland in search of new lands and resources. Rurik knew that this journey would be difficult, but he felt that his destiny was somehow intertwined with these distant lands. Many others had gone before him, but few had returned, and those who did brought tales of hardship, hostility, and even death. Yet in his mind, there was something that drew him to Vinland, something deeper than the simple pursuit of wealth or glory. He saw in this land an opportunity not only for his survival, but for a rebirth of his own spirit. The journey to Vinland was not easy. The sea that separated the icy shores of Greenland from Vinland seemed endless, and the route was filled with fierce storms and treacherous winds. For days, the sails of the Viking ships fluttered in the winds, and the fear of being swallowed up by the vastness of the ocean was ever present. But, like a good Viking, Rurik did not fear death, but rather the lack of a greater purpose. They arrived in Vinland on a cold dawn, when the sun seemed to touch the horizon with a golden light that promised new possibilities. However, the reality that the Vikings found was not exactly what they imagined. The land was rich and full of resources, but also wild and hostile. The dense forests and turbulent rivers offered only a small measure of peace amidst the chaos. They were greeted by native tribes, who soon proved hostile, defending their territory with ferocity. At the same time, Vinland's winter arrived sooner than expected, and the fight for survival intensified. Yet it was in this adversity that Rurik and his companions encountered the real challenge, not just the battle against the natives, but the struggle against their own beliefs and ways of life. Rurik, over time, began to question the path the Vikings were taking in Vinland. The quest for conquest, riches, and glory seemed hollow in the face of the vastness of the land and the silent lessons it offered. He found himself torn between his pride in being a Viking warrior and his growing understanding that the natives' connection to nature, their wisdom about the balance of life, might be the true secret to survival in Vinland. It was a dilemma that plagued him. Could war and plunder, which had long been the cornerstones of Viking life, truly be sustainable in a land like this? Or, instead, would it be necessary to adapt and learn from those who had been in tune with the land for centuries? The questions began to weigh heavily on Rurik's shoulders, and he realized that his story arc had only just begun. He was no longer simply trying to survive, but seeking to understand the true meaning of living in a world where the future and the past met in the currents of the wind and the roots of ancient trees. His fate was now intertwined with that of Vinland, and the battle for a land, for honor and truth, would be fought not only with blades, but with the wisdom of adapting to the unknown. During Rurik's first 3 years in Vinland, what had once seemed like the promise of a new life had gradually become a relentless struggle for survival. The bitter north winds he had come to know well now tasted of an unfamiliar land, and the rivers he had once navigated with ease now presented treacherous obstacles, strewn with submerged rocks and raging currents. In his mind, there was only one mission: to establish a strong base where he and his companions could withstand whatever Vinland threw at them. The group that accompanied him, a handful of Vikings hardened by life but also worn down by loss and isolation, found him a quiet strength. The settlement was founded in a strategic location along a great river that flowed into the sea, between a dense forest and distant mountains. The site, with its sprawling oak and pine trees, seemed like perfection in a world that already seemed so unforgiving. The Viking settlement was rudimentary, but functional. The houses were built of sturdy timber, with thatched roofs and moss, and stone chimneys that billowed smoke into the gray sky. In the center was a large training area, where the Vikings would gather to test their fighting skills and discuss the future of the settlement. The forges were always in operation, the sound of hammers striking iron like music to Rurik's ears. It was here, on this small patch of land, that the Vikings tried to create a new life, a life that, to many, meant freedom. But there was nothing easy about their new life in Vinland. The land, though promising, was wild and unknown, and every expedition, every hunt, every search for resources, was a constant struggle against the environment and the native people who also called this place home. Rurik, as a leader, knew that survival depended on more than just building and hunting. He needed to make sure everyone was well trained and prepared for whatever was needed. The hunts were crucial to keeping the settlement supplied. During the early years, he led his expeditions personally, with his men at his side. The forests of Vinland, with their tall, dense trees, seemed to hide mythical creatures in every shadow. Deer and elk were plentiful, but the real challenge was hunting the massive bison that roamed the southern plains. Rurik knew that the meat of these animals would be crucial to their survival during the harsh winter. Each hunt was a battle, not only against the beast, but against nature itself. On one such hunt, in particular, Rurik found himself face to face with a massive bison that he had been trekking for days, following its tracks through the snow. With an axe in hand and the confidence of a leader who did not fear the unknown, he led his men to the attack. The bison was brought down, but not without a fierce fight. The marks of the battle were etched into Rurik's flesh, and the satisfaction of seeing his prey fall was quickly replaced by the need to return to the settlement before night fell and the forces of the forest became a real threat. However, the real struggle was not just the animals they hunted or the harsh weather conditions. The natives, the Skrælings, were a constant and relentless presence. At first, the Vikings tried to establish a peaceful relationship with the natives, but tensions quickly began to flare. As the Vikings built their settlement, their flames and smoke caught the attention of the local tribes. Try as they might to keep the peace, the arrival of the Vikings was not welcomed. Several skirmishes broke out, often without warning, as native groups attacked Viking sentries or plundered stored resources. Rurik realized that fighting the natives would not be easy. Quick and bold strategies were needed. During one of his raids against a small tribe that had encroached on the settlement's borders, Rurik and his men set out on a mission at night. He led the charge with the precision of a veteran, his axes cutting through the air as the battle raged in the shadows. The Vikings advanced furiously, crushing any resistance, but Rurik knew this was only a temporary battle. The war was only just beginning. Over time, the Vikings learned to fight more cunningly and to plan their strategies more carefully. It was clear to Rurik that survival in Vinland would depend not only on hunting and fighting, but on understanding the cycles of nature, the roots of the natives, and the dynamics of the settlement itself. He began to coordinate more frequent patrols around the area and organized the Vikings into defensive groups. On one such day, when the temperature was mild and the wind was calmer, a group of Vikings, led by Rurik, ventured into a valley to the east to gather more wood and gemstones. The journey was uneventful, but as they returned to the settlement, something seemed off. The silence in the forests was broken only by the sound of dry leaves being trampled underfoot, but there was no one around. As they entered the settlement, Rurik immediately felt a weight in the air. Something was off. The houses were empty, and the fires in the furnaces were not burning as they usually did. A chill ran down Rurik's spine as he looked around. He knew that danger was closer than he had imagined, and suddenly, as if fate were rolling its final dice, a rain of arrows cut through the silence of the morning. The Vikings were under attack. The arrows, sharp and fast, cut through the air, plunging into the woods of the houses and the bodies of those in the field. Screams of terror and pain filled the air, as Rurik's men ran to their makeshift hiding places, grabbing their weapons. Rurik, with the agility of a wolf, drew his axe firmly and shouted orders to his men. The battle had begun, but what disturbed him most was the absolute silence of the surrounding forests. He sensed that the attack was not something simple. There was a meaning behind it, something greater. In the heat of the battle, Rurik was consumed by adrenaline, but his mind was working 1,000 miles an hour. Who was behind this attack? Was it an attack by a native tribe, or was something even greater approaching, something he could not see? As the fighting raged, Rurik braced himself for what was to come, but in his heart he knew this would not be a war like the ones before. Something more was being revealed, and the first signs of a great cataclysm were about to erupt in the heart of Vinland. It was the beginning of something much greater. The sound of battle rose like the roar of a sleeping monster, shattering the morning silence of the forest and becoming the only echo in Vinland. The settlement, which until moments before had been a safe haven from the relentless elements and the sporadic attacks of the Skraelings, was now in imminent danger. The onslaught of the natives was immense, and the Vikings, taken by surprise, were quickly being pressed against the walls they had built, not of stone, but of wood and hope. Rurik, breathing heavily and looking calculating, knew that the battle would be different from any they had faced before. This was no simple skirmish. It was a war for survival, and the forests of Vinland, as always, were alert, watching the suffering of those who dared challenge their rule. The battle began without warning, a rain of cruel arrows cutting through the air with the precision of seasoned hunters. They came from all directions, so fast that the Vikings could barely react. It was an army of about 200 natives, fierce and relentless, with warriors who moved like shadows in the forest, their agility and knowledge of the terrain making them almost invisible. The Vikings, on the other hand, were only 50, exhausted from the last hunt and unprepared for such a massive attack. Arrows struck the bodies of several of Rurik's men right away, and the sound of metal cutting through flesh and screams of pain were the only sounds that filled the air. Rurik, in a primitive instinct for survival, ordered an immediate defensive formation. The uneven terrain, with its hills and trees, made it difficult to see, but the Vikings formed a compact line, placing their swords and axes in front, trying to protect the most vulnerable and fight off the unexpected attack. The Viking blades cut through the air, and the battle axes cut into the bodies of the natives who dared to approach. But, for each one that fell, more appeared. The natives, as if they were part of the forest itself, advanced with the force of a rising tide, while the Vikings, resilient but surprised, began to realize that the fight would be harder than they had imagined. The natives attacked with skill, using guerrilla tactics that left the Vikings at a disadvantage. They moved quickly, jumping from one tree to another, emerging from the shadows and then disappearing again, only to attack from a new angle. The arrows continued to fly, some flaming, some poisoned, and the Vikings, though brave, were losing ground. Rurik, ever alert, watched the battle like a predator. He shouted orders, but something inside him told him that time was running out. The Vikings were organizing themselves as best they could, but with each passing minute, the number of dead grew. He saw one of his brothers in arms, Olaf, fall, an arrow sticking in his chest. Another, Eric, was shot in the back as he tried to protect his younger ones. The smell of blood and smoke mingled with the sound of arrows and the noise of fighting. With the defensive line failing, Rurik knew they could not hold out much longer. The battle was not being won, it was being lost. The heat of the fight was becoming unbearable, and the pressure from the natives was not letting up. In a last-ditch effort to save his men, Rurik shouted to his most loyal followers, to the forest, "Save yourselves!" 4 Vikings, including Rurik, abandoned their heavy weapons, grabbed their torches and ran towards the dense forest, trying to escape the clutches of death. The tall trees and thick vegetation might have given them a chance, but the distance between them and their enemies was rapidly shrinking. The trees seemed to envelop the Vikings, as if they wanted to protect them or swallow them. The forest of Vinland, unforgiving and wild, seemed to take on a life of its own, becoming a weapon for both those fleeing and those attacking. Rurik and his companions ran, their feet pounding against the ground covered in dry leaves, their breathing heavy and sharp. The sound of arrows and battle cries grew more and more distant, but the tension never diminished. They knew they were being followed, and their only goal now was to disappear into the shadows of the forest. After a while, they stopped, tired and out of breath, but the idea of returning to the settlement was unthinkable. The natives, relentless as a storm, would continue their attack without mercy. But Rurik did not know what to do next. He was exhausted, but his mind was still working at 1,000 miles an hour. He knew he needed a strategy to counterattack, but for now, all he could feel was the bitterness of defeat and the loss of so many good men. They had run for a long time, but the forest, which had seemed to be their salvation, now seemed to swallow them with its immensity. It was at that moment, with the torches trembling in his hands, that something caught Rurik's attention. A thick smoke, not the smoke of the flames they had left behind, but smoke that seemed to be rising from somewhere ahead. Rurik lifted his head, trying to make out what was ahead of him. What had seemed like mere mist in the distance began to take shape. He advanced cautiously, the other Vikings following silently behind him. When they got close enough, Rurik was astonished at what he saw. A native village, larger than any he had seen before, loomed before them. The houses were made of tree trunks, covered with animal skins, and there were signs of a vibrant, well-established life. But what caught Rurik's attention most were not the houses or the animals. It was the structure, the organization. This village seemed to be the heart of a force far greater than any he had encountered before. He knew, with a chill running down his spine, that what lay before them was no mere tribe, but something that could hold the key to the future of Vinland, and perhaps the end of the Vikings there. The silence of the forest surrounding Rurik and his men seemed heavier than ever. Each step on the damp earth was a thunderous sound in their ears, as if nature itself was watching them, waiting for them to make the slightest mistake. They had moved away from the village, but the fear of being followed and found was a constant weight on their backs. The fire of the torches trembled in Rurik's tired hands as he walked ahead, his eyes alert to every movement around them. The tension between the 5 men was palpable. Words had been few since they had sighted the village. They were all aware that they were in enemy territory, and any noise could mean death. The decision to flee had been made in a desperate breath. There were no other options. Rurik knew that if they stayed, they would be hunted like animals, and the Viking settlement could not be defended with so few men. But what was left now? Run where? The emptiness of the forest seemed like a maze with no exit, a place the Vikings had never imagined being. It was as if the winds, the trees, and the earth themselves had conspired against them. The shadows danced with the rhythm of their steps, and the stars that had once been their guide were now obscured by heavy clouds, adding to their discomfort. As they desperately tried to get away from the village, the only thing Rurik could think about was what would happen if they failed to escape. They were exhausted, and the long walk through the dense undergrowth only made the feeling of desperation grow stronger. There was something strange in the air, something that made Rurik's skin crawl with every passing moment. He couldn't put it into words, but he felt as if a storm was gathering above them, ready to break loose at any moment. The wind seemed to have died down, which had previously been a sign of imminent danger. Something was about to happen. The village was now in the distance, but the feeling of being watched was inescapable. Every time they stopped to rest, the shadows seemed to move, and the sounds of the forest became more intense. Even Rurik's own eyes were beginning to doubt what they were seeing. Or was it the darkness taking over his mind? The tension was becoming unbearable. With every step, he looked back, expecting to see any sign of movement in the trees, but there was none. They continued on, unsure of where they were going, like a lost group trying to outrun their fate. And then, just as the last hope of a peaceful escape seemed to fade, the worst happened. A light breeze arose, but with it, a distant sound. The snap of a broken twig. Rurik stopped immediately, raising his hand, signaling the others to prepare. His men fell into absolute silence, each one aware of what that sound meant. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. They were being followed. With a quick gesture, Rurik gave the order to disperse, but before they could move, a volley of arrows cut through the air, plunging into the trees around them. The sound of the spear's taut string still echoed in their ears as the Vikings began to run, but the forest, which had seemed to be their ally until then, became a deadly trap. As if the earth itself was swallowing them, the ground betrayed them. They were surrounded. Rurik, with his sword already drawn, shouted to his men, "Run! Don't stop!" But there was no escaping fate. The natives, who knew the forest like the back of their hands, emerged from the shadows with terrifying speed. They surrounded them, appearing like ghosts, their tall, savage figures leaping from the trees and emerging from among the foliage, their faces painted and their eyes filled with uncontrollable fury. There were more natives than Rurik had imagined, and the number of his men was already dwindling by the second. The sound of a blade cutting through flesh and the muffled screams of his brothers in arms filled the air. There was no time to think, only to react. In a last-ditch effort, Rurik fought with all his remaining fury, cutting down one native warrior after another. But with every move he made, more appeared. He knew the fight was lost. Resistance was futile. His men were falling, and the last torch he held now trembled in his hands as a bitter reminder of what they were losing. But before it was too late, an immense force grabbed his arms, pulling him back, immobilizing him with brutal force. His vision blurred by pain and exhaustion, Rurik was forced to kneel before his captors. What followed was a sequence of shadows and screams, and for a moment, he was lost in the void of consciousness. But when he opened his eyes again, the first thing he saw was the beaten earth floor and the smoke rising nearby. He was surrounded, his men fallen, and the feeling of helplessness was almost unbearable. The natives had captured them. Rurik knew that nothing could be worse than this. His eyes lifted to look around him, and what he saw made him freeze. He was now in front of a large tent, where the village chief, an imposing man, watched his movements with disconcerting calm. Around him, the other prisoners were being dragged away, and the smoke rising from the fire in the distance only increased the tension of the moment. He could feel the gazes of the natives, their expressions of fury mixed with curiosity. The native leader approached, his presence intimidating, and with a simple gesture, ordered Rurik to stand. Rurik felt the piercing eyes of the chieftain on him, as if judging him, and in that moment, he knew that he was about to face something much greater than any battle, something that could change everything he believed in. He and his men were in the hands of an immense enemy, and now, the only thing left was to wait. The last thing Rurik heard before being led to the large tent of the village was the sound of the trees swaying in the wind, the sound of an uncertain fate, the breath of a storm that was about to break over Vinland. And so the journey ended. What would happen to him and his men, no one knew. But one thing was certain. The war for Vinland was far from over. The journey continues. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.